this lesson, we're going to look at the midpoint formula and what it means to be a segment bisector and an angle bisector. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to determine or tell me or your facilitator the difference between a segment bisector and an angle bisector. So let's begin. First of all, the midpoint of a segment. Well, what a midpoint is, it's a point that divides the segment into two congruent parts. Okay, so it's a point that will divide the segment into two congruent parts. Now, we can have many different things that bisect a segment. The things that we can have that will bisect a segment are a line, a ray, a segment, or even a plane, and it intersects the segment at its midpoint. So a line, a ray, a segment, or a plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. So for example, if this was my segment, here is my midpoint, and I know it's my midpoint because I've labeled each part of that segment as congruent. And that is a line that bisects the segment. So let's take a look at a problem here. If RS bisects segment PQ, our job is to find the value of N. So if it bisects PQ, that means T has to be the midpoint, which means that segment PT is the same as segment TQ. So I can say that PT is congruent to TQ. Well, we know that if things are congruent, that means that they're equal in measure. Therefore, I can say, and actually I should put segment marks there, PT is 3n minus 5 is equal to 7. And now my job is to go ahead and solve for n. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So 3n is equal to 12. Divide both sides by 3, and we get n is equal to 4. So the value of n is 4. What that means is if I were to plug 4 into this expression right here, well, 3 times 4 minus 5 is 7, and that works. This segment length is 7, and this segment length is 7. Let's take a look at another way that we can talk about midpoints. We can find the midpoint between 2 points. So if I had x1 and y1, so there's my first coordinate point, and then you were given x2 and y2. When we think about finding a midpoint, we're finding the middle. And when we find the middle of something, we add the corresponding parts together and then divide by 2. So here's what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and take x1 and add the other x value to it, divide by 2. And then I'm going to take my y1 and I'm going to add my y2 and I'm going to divide that by 2. Using this formula is going to give me the midpoint of any segment. So let's check this out. I want to find the midpoint of LN. Well, if we just give you a graph and it's on a horizontal or a vertical line, we can just count to find the midpoint. So since this is a horizontal line, the length of LN is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. This whole entire length is 12. Well, if that whole thing is 12, then I know the midpoint, or the middle, is going to be 6 away from the endpoint. So from L, I'm going to count over 6. And that is my midpoint. That value is 1, 3 would be the midpoint. Now let's go ahead and find the midpoint of AB if A is at -4, 6 and B is at 7, 2. Go ahead and try this, pause the video, and when you're ready to check your solution, come on back. All right, welcome back. So for me to find the midpoint, -4 is my first x, and 6 is my first y. 7 is my second x, and 2 is my second y. So using the midpoint formula, I'm going to add my x's together. So -4 plus 7, and then I'm going to divide by 2. For my y's, I'm going to add them together. So 6 plus 2, and then I'm going to divide by 2. I'm going to simplify the numerator first. So -4 plus 7 is 3 over 2. We're going to leave it as 3 halves. 6 plus 2 is 8, and then I need to divide by 2. Well, when you have a fraction that can't be simplified, we're going to leave it improper. We're going to leave it as 3 over 2. And 8 divided by 2 is 4. So my midpoint is 3 halves, comma 4. Here's another way we can use the midpoint formula. If the midpoint of segment JK is 6, comma 3, and J is at 5, 11, we have to find the coordinates of K. So this one's a little bit different. We can think about it. Here's J and K, and I know I'm not graphing them correctly, but let's say J is at 5, comma 11. I have a midpoint, which is at 6, 3, and this time I have to find that value for K. Well, normally we're given the K value. So all we had to do is add our x's for J and K, divide by 2, and do the same for y's. Well, this time, I'm still going to apply the midpoint formula. And I'm still going to take 5, and I'm going to add x this time. And I'm going to divide that by 2, but my solution should be the x value of my midpoint, which is 6. Now thinking about the y's, if I were going to find the midpoint of JK, I would take 11, and I would add y, and I would divide it by 2, and what I should get out of that answer is 3. So now I'm going to solve each of these equations. So for my first one, since that entire equation is being divided by 2, to undo division, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. Those will cancel. So 5 plus x is equal to 12. Subtract 5. I get x is equal to 7. So the x value for k is 7. So over here now, since I'm dividing by 2, I'm going to undo divide by 2 and multiply both sides by 2. I end up with 11 plus y is equal to 6. Subtract 11. And I get y is equal to -5. So the y coordinate is -5. And there is the coordinate of k, 7, -5. Let's take a look at one more thing. Let's talk about an angle bisector. Well, an angle bisector is similar to a segment bisector in that it bisects or it splits something into two congruent parts. So an angle bisector is a ray or a line that divides the angle into two congruent angles. So a ray or a line that divides the angle into two congruent angles. So for example, if I had angle A, B, C, and I were to draw in ray BD, if it was an angle bisector, that would mean that angle CBD would be congruent to angle ABD, and we show that by those arc marks. So take a look at this example. Ray SV bisects angle RST, and your job is to find the value of x and the measure of angle VST. So pause the video, try this, and when you're ready, come back and we'll see how you did. Welcome back. Well, if SV is an angle bisector, then I know these two angles right here are congruent, which means 4x minus 5 has to equal 3x plus 4. So to solve for x, I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. So x minus 5 is equal to 4. Add 5 to both sides, and I get an x value of 9. So that was part of my problem. I had to find what x was. The next thing we're going to do is find the measure of angle VST. So VST is this angle right here. Well, VST is equal to 3x plus 4. So I'm going to take that x value of 9 and substitute it in. So I'll have 3 times 9 plus 4. Well, that's going to be 27 plus 4 is going to be 31 degrees. So there you have it. There's some information about angle bisectors and segment bisectors.